Good morning from a very early good morning from the UK, and welcome to all of you tuning in to our webinar focusing on India. So this morning we are going to be looking at India, as I said, and asking the question, is India the world's next big outbound market? So we'll be taking a look at how the market's recovered from COVID and a little beyond that. The rise of IndiGo, and just asking ourselves some questions around to what extent could India become a global hub for travellers. As usual, we'll take questions throughout the webinar and we'll answer them as we go, so please use the chat box to do that. Now, I'm delighted to be joined this morning, as ever, by John Grant, OAG's Chief Analyst. Good morning, John.
Hi, good morning. I'm delighted to be here at 6 o'clock in the morning with you, Deidre.
I bet you are. I bet you are, John. I can hear the enthusiasm radiating out across the internet. We're also really delighted to be joined by Sandeep Bahl this morning, although it's not morning. Well, maybe it's very early morning where you are, Sandeep. Sandeep is the Executive Program Director for the U.S.-India Aviation Cooperation Program and has lots of experience in the industry and beyond. And is also an expert on the Indian aviation industry. So I'm sure will be bringing us some fascinating insights this morning. Good morning, Sandeep.
Good morning, Deidre and John. Same as delighted to be here. It's pretty early in the morning for me, so thank you.
Great. Well, that's a giveaway that you're not actually in India this morning, but perfect. Okay, let's dive in then. So before we go into the specific slides that we have for you on India, we're just giving an overview of our usual capacity slide that we provide in these webinars. So it's an interesting position, isn't it, John? We've got some markets really starting to climb into recovery. We've seen China, obviously, over the last 12, 18 months, just peak up and down, but we're back up at that sort of just below zero level, with no sign really of that changing, although the forward look and capacity is pretty optimistic, isn't it?
Yeah, I think
that's the unknown, isn't it? To what extent that's going to materialise.
I think we should also always be a little bit cautious about how forward-looking capacity is, particularly when we get beyond perhaps 2 months forward. There's always a bit of doubt, but generally, the picture paints a thousand words, doesn't it? We're moving in the right direction at last, which is great. Still at about 82 million seats a week, which we've been at for the last 3 weeks, which is good, but clearly still nowhere near back to the 109 million type range we were seeing in 2019. So we've still got a long way to go, but there's positive noises in nearly every region of the world. I see New Zealand and Australia are moving forward rapidly with allowing international travel. Malaysia is reopening. Restrictions are being eased in Singapore. In the United Kingdom today, we no longer need to fill out one of those lengthy passenger locator forms. And if you're traveling with British Airways or Virgin or nearly any British airline, you no longer need a face mask to travel, as long as you're traveling to a country that has eased their restrictions as well. So lots of positives, but a couple of areas where we're still way behind the curve and stranded. And you touched on China. Northeast Asia, I think, is in part holding the rest of Asia to ransom. China's capacity looked pretty good when you compare it to 2 and 3 years ago, but the reality is nearly 99% of that is domestic capacity, which is unsustainable and unprofitable in the long term for the airlines that are operating, and they desperately need to start flying. And Japan is equally Still in lockdown. Very, very difficult to see a way forward in the short term there. That's as much about a cautious approach as testing facilities for PCR, which are nowhere near as freely as available as in other parts of the world. So generally, yeah, it's getting better. It's getting better. There's no doubt about it.
I think that inconsistency, though, for the global traveller, you know, or the long haul, or the sort of intercontinental traveller, is going to be really a restraint, isn't it, on recovery? Because as much as you said, in the UK, we're dropping wearing masks. There's a relaxation in terms of some of the bureaucracy around travel that we've had to put up with, but that's not going to be the case for all markets, and that recovery, or that unwinding of restrictions, is not going to be linear, is it? So I think for travellers, the bad news to some extent is that, you know, you're going to have to still prepare for all of the steps, and then be pleasantly surprised if you don't have to tick all of the boxes to actually be allowed to travel.
And I think that is where we're going to be for the next year and a half, perhaps, where we're going to have these different restrictions and requirements, pre-travel testing on arrival. But I've been traveling recently, and Sandeep obviously has as well. I've been pleasantly surprised by the load factors I've seen around me. There are a lot of people who are prepared to go through lots of hoops and loops to have the necessary paperwork to be able to travel. So that pent-up demand is translating into volume.
Yeah. And let's hope that continues, really.
Yeah.
The bright spot for me in this chart, of course, is India. So the brown line here, or is this a sort of a greeny brown colour, shows that in terms of capacity for this month, India is standing alone in terms of being above zero, by comparison to, and zero being the baseline of March 2019.
And
of course,
phenomenal growth in the last month, Deidre. I mean, it's just got, it's almost like a rocket. It's probably the most rapid recovery of any market in the last 2 years. Staggering.
And Sandeep, we heard the news, didn't we, last week, that internationally things are reopening at the end of this month, and I guess that's reflected in these numbers, isn't it?
Yeah, so end of the summer schedule 2022 will have India opening for international travel, and those numbers are there. It will be to the countries where it's the other countries are reciprocating. Like China, Japan is still kind of closed. But as soon as that, but all of Europe, US is always been open, to be honest. It's
Okay. So let's take a look more specifically then, and it's quite a busy slide. There's quite a bit going on, but essentially we wanted to just look with slightly different lenses at what was happening in the Indian market. So we've got domestic and international recovery in terms of capacity by month. We've then got low cost versus legacy, and you can see obviously the effect there of strong low cost operator in the market, and these are just the associated percentage versus the same month in 2019. So I guess it's that trajectory that we saw on the other slide, broken down by domestic and international.
It encapsulates, I think, many of the trends that we've seen through the pandemic, and now as we're in that sort of recovery mode. Now, this snapshot is very similar in many markets. We knew from very early in the pandemic that those markets with domestic or large domestic demand and capacity were in a better place because that sort of travel still was allowed to continue. And international virtually stopped in most countries for a period of time, or was very fragmented and patchy. And we've also seen low-cost airlines being so much more entrepreneurial, flexible, quick to move, fleet of foot to build back recovery faster than anyone else. And just another example, in the UK, Jet2, low-cost airline that probably doesn't get as much share of attention as it deserves. They have over 90 aircraft, now have more capacity operating than they did in 2019. Ryanair are sort of 90% of where they were, and British Airways are still circa 80%. Legacy carriers have struggled to recover quickly. The complexity, they've got a double whammy. They have a much higher reliance on international traffic.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's difficult with all the complexities we were talking about earlier. And they therefore not managed to get their networks back up and running as efficiently as the low-cost airlines. And as we come out of this, I think the worry for the legacy airlines around the world, particularly in those markets where there is real competition, is how much further ahead the low-cost airlines will have moved by the time we're back to a position of recovery. Will the European carriers really be able to compete against low-cost carriers in the European point-to-point market? Probably not. Going to be very, very difficult.
And there's a double whammy, of course, as well, isn't there, of oil prices having an impact on long-haul carriers too. So yeah, the cards are sort of stacked against them at the moment, aren't they, in terms of how they recover.
I saw an earnings report, or two earnings reports, one from Delta and one from American overnight, and the CFO at Delta was saying they're going to have to put a fuel surcharge on of average of between, I think it was $20 and $30. Now, if that's the average, and assuming that it is an average, then at the top end of that scale for the transatlantic type sectors and the long-haul flights, we're probably, it wouldn't be unreasonable to see $50 or $60 surcharges one way.
Yeah.
Being put into air.
I guess if you add that to, if you're traveling to a market where where there's still testing requirements, then it all adds up, doesn't it?
Yeah, and don't listen to this webinar. Go and book your summer holiday flight now.
Yeah, let's get ourselves out of that cycle of depression.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on then to have a bit of a deeper look at India. So we thought it would be interesting, obviously, just to look at India and some peers in terms of size and volume. And I think it's interesting in light of what you were saying about Japan and Northeast Asia generally, John, that India is now third largest in capacity terms, and that's obviously because of that rapid recovery that we've seen. But I think what's also interesting is when we look at India's biggest international markets by capacity, there's a story there, isn't there? It's not a new story about to what extent markets are being served directly from India internationally versus routing through other points, namely the United Arab Emirates. There's a big flow, isn't there, through?
There is. I think we'd all be, many of us would perhaps be surprised about, how quickly India has come back, but also that at least for this week, it's a larger market than Japan. Now, Japan has virtually, has very little international capacity at the moment, and will bounce back, and there will be a close contest before the two. But it is interesting as well, as you say, about what are those major markets for Indian travel. The UAE is obviously the largest, and that's a whole combination of different reasons for travel, professional travel, workers, connecting flows. It's come back really strongly, and of course, when there's been limited international services from India, routing through the Middle East and not just the UAE but Qatar has been an attractive option for many. So it's fascinating to see how these destinations have come back.
And I think actually we'll probably come on to this later on, but that's going to be the challenge, isn't it, for Indian carriers serving international markets, is to claw back some of that indirect traffic that's going via the Middle East at the minute.
Yeah, it's fascinating times. You know, I saw a picture yesterday of the new chairman of Air India proudly sitting at a desk with an aircraft model in front of him. It might be an historic aircraft model in a couple of years, but you know, they've got a real challenge to build back their business. But we'll come on to discuss that in more detail, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Sandeep, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, the India market overall, when you see the recovery, is the fastest, no doubt. But it's also driven by more of the domestic part, and we will see further down how the domestics continue to grow, especially with the low-cost carriers. With what John mentioned about Air India, you know, they just reorganizing themselves right now. So it's going to take a little bit time, because if they want to do more long hauls, they will need more wide body aircrafts, which, as you know, it's not easy to get right now. So let's see.
You know, it's really difficult when you're in a storm to reorganize yourself. Is probably the worst possible moment to be doing that, isn't it? You've got all of this going on around you. Everyone's moving forward quickly, faster, further, and you're trying to you know, just reorganize, and it's like moving the furniture on the decks of the Titanic, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's and you know, with the uncertainties that we have in aviation, so you know, building up a future strategy gets a little bit difficult. But overall, we think with the capacity growing and the outbound market is continue to grow, India has a good story coming forward in future.
And I think that leads nicely on to my to my next slide, which I think this is it's the bit beyond here that's the question, isn't it, really? So we've seen obviously you know, a really positive trajectory of growth in the domestic market in India, and some of that has obviously been stimulated by the UDAN scheme, which we'll talk a little bit about later. It's and you know, the sense I suppose is that some of the turmoil of this period has been shaken off, and the market has really stabilized and grown. Where next? You know, where does this line go? Does it continue on that trajectory? Does it flatten off? You know, does this international market really move to become a larger share, or at least an equitable share with the domestic market? And how realistic is that, given what we know about the dynamics of the Indian market?
Yeah,
lots of questions in there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's fascinating if you look at the growth in domestic capacity from 2015 forward to 2018, and it slowed down. Obviously, that's the impact of UDAN and other such developments. But I question whether that was actually sustainable over a much longer period of time. You know, that sort of capacity growth over a 10-year period. And it's not about whether there's the demand, it's as much about whether there is the infrastructure to support that sort of capacity growth. You know, airports, some of the big airports are already congested. unable to handle what they, what's being produced at the moment. So that's really interesting. And of course, in that period here, Deidre, that we're talking about in the domestic market, price of fuel was relatively cheap. Now we're living in a world with an 87% increase in fuel prices year on year. Is that sustainable? Is demand elastic enough that they can absorb those sort of things? The international looks a much more sensible level of growth. I've just seen that we got Willie Balter from IndiGo on the webinar, so I need to be careful what I say about IndiGo as we go forward. Don't want to upset them.
Not that you wouldn't be careful anyway, John. Sandeep, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, Deidre and John, if India continues to have this domestic increase, even when you look at in 2008, when the rest of the world was going through this financial crisis and whatnot, India continued to grow, and so it stood out that time. And we can see the reason being it has the domestic market and per capita income continue to grow. But as John said, the infrastructure in recent years, there's a lot of money being poured in to building new airports or existing airports. Like New Delhi now has a brand new Terminal 1 for low-cost carriers. And so so they continue to look at how to build the ground infrastructure, and we will talk a little bit later on where other airports are coming in. Overall, when you look at the capacity, as John mentioned with IndiGo, they continue to get their aircraft deliveries. We are also looking at some new airlines coming in. So overall, we'll see this capacity, at least for domestic market, continue to grow. The market is still there. There is demand. As John said, you travel internationally. There are hardly any seats left. India domestic is also doing pretty good. The 70-80% load factor is normal here. So
yeah. And that's encouraging, isn't it? Particularly at this point in a pandemic. Let's go on to our next slide. So this was a sort of a question that we posed really about. It's really evident when you look around the pace of recovery across Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and to some extent the Southwest Pacific region, about the reliance on outbound travel from China. And it sort of begged the question for us around, to what extent India could, as an outbound market, fill the Chinese outbound gap. And it's one of those kind of theoretical questions that there's lots of reasons why it couldn't. But we thought it was worthy of some comparison, just in terms of looking at what are the top Chinese outbound destinations. And again, we're using 2019 as a baseline. At some point we'll have to stop doing that, but it's as good as anything else for now. And then the top Indian outbound destinations as well, and then how these actually compare. And of course, you can see, on the Indian side, this is very much being driven really by migrant workforce, VFR type traffic, because there's a huge Indian diaspora, isn't there? And we've got some details on that on the next slide. Versus the Chinese outbound markets, which are much more driven by a sort of true leisure market.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and it's one we always pose, isn't it? Wow, if you look at the growth in India, it's rapid. Could it catch up with China? But they are two very different markets with very different reasons for travel and consumer profiles. Chinese travelers, particularly those on leisure, are some of the highest spenders on on a bit international trip, both in terms of airport revenues, tax-free sales, retail, but also when they're in destinations. And that isn't quite the same profile of the Indian international traveller. I think the average Chinese traveller at Heathrow literally spends hundreds of pounds when they return to China, and that isn't the case for Indian travellers or indeed most other nationalities in the world. So there are very different demographic and socioeconomic profiles, and touching on that diaspora thing, a lot of the international traffic from India is VFR based, visiting friends, family and relatives, with extended stays, perhaps 4 weeks, 6 weeks when they do travel. So very, very different market characteristics. But I think it is interesting that you can see on the right hand side, those big markets, Thailand, the USA. I mean, that's a huge market. The USA market is probably still underserved, and there's more potential there.
Yeah, if you look at, there are two different markets when you look at these charts. It's as John mentioned, the Chinese, when it comes to leisure travel, they are very big, and their destinations are totally different what we look at from India. India continues to have big number going to UAE, mostly as executives going there or workers going there. But when it comes to pure leisure, you don't find many. Thailand's still there for Indians to go there, and USA is there a little bit, but it's also combines with VFR and a lot of students. So these two are very different markets. And other thing is, with China, a lot of connectivity is all non-stops to a destination, right? So like between China and Thailand, for example, there was a time when they used to have like 50 plus flights a day.
Yeah.
So that kind of connectivity, non-stop flights, I think between USA and China is also, they have almost 100 plus flight used to be per day. So it's a totally different market. But India, so with this, the destination marketing people now have to really look at how to promote these destinations that the Chinese probably gonna be offloading, how to get into India. So that's an opportunity that sits with these countries to as India continue to grow. Now 44 countries I know don't need a visa for Indian travelers. So when those restrictions continue to go away, there will be more outbound destinations. And it's recently, if you we didn't see that here, but if you see, Maldives has taken off from India, and actually some of the traffic that Maldives lost from China, that particular place, India filled some of it. So
yeah, I think the Maldives is one of those destinations that just really has done very well, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think we'll continue to see that happen, won't we? I suppose what's interesting is to what extent, and I'll just skip on to our next slide. We tried originally to get all of this onto the one slide because I think this illustrates really what we're talking about. When you look at Indians abroad in terms of the diaspora, the biggest markets, I think account for just these 5 countries account for almost 16 million Indians living abroad, and there's a much bigger market as well if we'd included all of the countries. I suppose what's interesting is to what extent that continues into the next generation and beyond. Is there still a net outflow of people choosing to leave India and work elsewhere and travel elsewhere, or is there going to be a shift in terms of demographics and people being, comfortable to work and to base themselves in India and continue to develop as the economy continues to develop. I suppose that's the question. And then does that lead to a more mature outbound market in terms of leisure and business?
Yeah, I think it's a really it's an interesting question. I mean, I can't help but see optimism and see positivity about how they can. And I know that will shock some of the people on the webinar that I'm being positive, but the outbound Indian market is going to grow and grow, and that GDP level that we see at the moment is going to grow over time, and we are at the aggregate level achieving these volumes with a GDP per capita of about $2,000 per head. Then even when you begin to move the needle just a little bit on an upward trajectory, we're going to see quite significant volume increases, and that will be both in domestic and international. So I think the diaspora is very important, and there will always be that back and forth traffic that we see, and there will probably be more of it. But even the outbound, I think, Sandeep, there's just more intrigue. There's just more, a little bit more disposable income. There's people who want to go and explore. It's going to grow, isn't it?
Yeah, John, India, one incredible thing about India is India has, I would say, like kind of a dual economy. When we take an average, like that's what we have done here. India's per capita is about $2,000. But when you look at the middle income earners, that number is pretty decent. I think it goes up more than about 300 million or something. And with that, plus the 18 million people who are living overseas, and I tell you, those people who are overseas, their capita, their disposable income is pretty high. And you combine those two, then there are opportunities. I always tell people, like, you have to really focus on two dual systems that India is going through. There's huge poverty, as we know, but the standards are going up. But at the same time, they're very rich Indians. If you look at billionaires now, the Asia's richest 2 or 3 guys live in India now. So with that, there's a change that is coming. And the focus, it is something similar to China. If you recall, after 2008, after Olympics, the focus went absolutely on the middle income earners in China, and they were the ones who drove outbound travel. It's the same thing that we can see in India also going to happen. So, yeah.
I suppose the other interesting question is the inbound potential. We haven't really talked about that, have we? In terms of to what extent, and there's a difference, isn't there, in terms of people's ability to travel, especially now, freely into China versus India, and to what extent there's a more established tourist market for inbound travel to India. I think that's an interesting proposition, isn't it?
Yeah, I was just smiling to myself when Sandeep was saying something, and he just said, India's incredible, and it has, from a tourism perspective, that tagline of incredible India is really strong, and I think there'll be increasing interest and desire to visit India. The infrastructure is improving, there's more domestic capacity, it's easier to get around the country. And I think it's got a lot of potential for inbound tourism over the next 10-15 years. The quality of the hotels is really high. The ground product is good. It's a relatively cheap destination to go to. So you get good value for money compared to many other markets. So it's everything is so positive about this place.
Do you think, Sandeep, the pandemic will impact on people's willingness to travel to India in the short term, or do you see that inbound is going to recover?
So, Deidre, good question. I would say there are 2 points. Right? One is COVID really hit India badly.
Mm-hmm.
So, perception about, hey, India, is it safe or not? But now, if you look at it, India is, most of the population is already vaccinated, and India was the fastest to vaccinate the whole 1.3 billion people. And the second part is what I see with this pandemic and work from home and other things, the people's mental well-being or health, mental health has been a little bit in a different mode. India is considered as a place for spiritual upbringing, right? So as John said, these infrastructure which are built now, and the hotels in some of these beautiful resorts where you can really go and do your yoga, you can really have a stress-free 7 days detox for your body as well as for your mental health. This is the first thing I think that India will start attracting.
Mm-hmm.
Destinations from south to north, up north, which cater to these travelers. It was happening earlier, but now, as because of this pandemic, I can already. We were watching. There are people already started coming in for going to these ashrams to get the yoga therapy or do their detoxification in different parts of India.
And Deidre, I think it's really silly things that make a difference into how a destination is perceived. So there's been 1 or 2 travel programs you may recall, because I know you're interested in these sort of things, where elderly people were going to stay in India for a month, former TV celebrities, and those sort of documentaries that paint India in a much more westernized but culturally rich destination. I think a moving the needle as well in terms of, oh, this is a fascinating place and it's worth going to. And India's beginning to be seen as more than just 3 or 4 very big cities with lots of population and some poverty attached to it, but actually being rich in landscapes, beauty, cultural diversity, and all of these things as well.
Yeah, interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how that inbound market evolves, isn't it? And to what extent, I suppose for any destination marketing or organization right now, it's about trying to anticipate how travel patterns will change, people's willingness to travel directly or indirectly, and the sorts of travel that they're looking for. So I'm there with the 7-day retreat, detox, whatever. That sounds quite compelling.
I can understand why the detox
morning here in the UK.
Yeah, and you see the ground infrastructure is improving a lot. New highways which are taking you to these faraway destinations, and as you we'll talk later on, there are a lot more new connectivity to different cities by air that started happening. So
that segues us nicely. That leads us nicely on to our next our next slide, which is really talking about something that we mentioned earlier, which is the domestic connectivity piece. And we've got a couple of slides here, really, just to try and unpick a little what has happened. Obviously, the UDAN scheme was launched with the intent of making travel accessible to the everyday person on the street. And certainly on the face of it, when we look at this, when we look at data over the last 5 years, and setting aside the impact of COVID, you can see that, so this is number of market pairs served from airports that have been categorized into groups based on size. And we did that on the basis of their seats in 2017. So the very big airports, over 10 million seats, are tier 1, and then you can see the sliding scale going down. So you can really see, can't you, the tier 5 airports, which essentially are ones that have started operating or had little or no service beforehand, have really had a very significant capacity increase over that time period. And similarly in tier 4, there's been a consistently stronger growth rate than anywhere else. So that, on the face of it, suggests that there has been significant improvement in connecting those smaller airports, which by definition are those that are sort of geographically remote.
Sandeep, from your perspective, living and breathing in the Indian market, has UDAN delivered what was expected?
So John, it's when you look at the capacity increase in the 4th tier, 3rd tier markets, so it's a great thing that it's happening. Yeah, the connectivity is there, flights are have been inaugurated. Airport infrastructure is still required. It's not the airport infrastructure as an airport, but access to those airports. The regional airports access is still very tricky. So many, and then with the highways coming up, beautiful highways are coming up, so some of these traffic that should switch over to airlines, it's not coming there yet. The idea is it's a great scheme to start with, but whether it will be profitable or is it sustainable for longer term for airlines. As you see, there are, they're only flying big jets or turbos, right? So capacity is like 50, 70 seaters. These markets, some of them you just need a 20-seater plane, probably.
Yeah.
And that goes to the crux of the issue, isn't it? I mean, this is a funded program of connectivity across Indian domestic markets, and therefore, when the funding stops or dries up, how much of this will still survive and still be around? To your point, some of these markets seem like they've got far too much capacity, or certainly don't have the right type of capacity. So, is this a short-term sort of thing, or will most of these stick? What's your reading?
So John, what I think, there are some markets which are really.
I'm just going to show what some of these are.
Yeah, there are some markets which are really taken off, no doubt, right? From, if you look at Delhi to Shirdi, that flight is doing pretty well. But then there are markets like yesterday, and the new connections keeps on coming. Yesterday there was a flight announced, I think, from Indore to Gondia to Hyderabad. Now these cities are Hyderabad is a big city, but Gondia and Indore are small cities. And then so there will be some markets, and many of the markets which was UDAN has earlier, I think there were more than 300 plus routes which were given. Not all of them are still operating. Some of them were taken off by airlines. As I said, the reason is, first is it's not a right metal for some of these markets. You can't be flying with a larger seat capacity when the market demand is only, or you do the hopping flights, right? And then the purpose of connectivity for the quick connectivity and quick way to go, then it goes away too. So. And anything, as you know, John, as anything, I give an example of anything that is being funded by government or given some concessions, and it's only for a short term, then the players are only there for that short term. If you look at the U.S. Essential Services Act, Essential Air Services Act, they have made sure that US is a big country and it's very small cities, whereas those connectivity, the large airlines or the small airlines, it's a part of the regime here that they have to continue with that. Something similar, India has to really look at it, whether they can also make some essential service, because there are destinations in India. If you really want to get there, it could take so much time. With the air connectivity, whether it's medical supplies or whether it's food supplies, it can be done very fast. And India learned that during the pandemic, when they have to send all these vaccinations around India. And the easiest way was to use these UDAN flights.
But Sandeep, it's interesting you mentioned the US domestic market. One of the challenges we've seen in a recovery in the US domestic market is a shortage of skilled competencies, and particularly pilots and flight decks, and some regional carriers have had to cancel services completely. I mean, when you look at what's happened in India, it begs the question: is there the resource, is there the flight deck and the necessary headcount to continue to grow at this rate? I mean, it's a lot of additional pilots and a lot of additional people required to operate these flights.
So John, yeah, India doesn't have a problem with the people. It's just whether they're skilled or not, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the good thing is, or you can say not a very good thing, but in past couple of years, there were some airlines, they bellied up, and with that, there's a lot more pilots became available in the market, and many of them were absorbed with the growth carriers, right? Now, also India has, as I mentioned just now, Gondia is a big pilot training school, and so pilot training schools are coming up in India. There are 3 or 4 now. So, and IndiGo, the largest airline, also they do their pilot training all around the world, actually. So, when it comes to essential skill set for like pilots and mechanics, we don't see there's any problem with that. India has enough, or they're developing this skill set. What India lacks is a genuine customer service style, the operational people, having, if you're having your baggage is not coming to you for 30 minutes, that's a no-no, right? Even in Atlanta, such a big airport, in 15 minutes my bag was on the belt, right? Now in India it doesn't happen. So those soft skills, when you go to India's check-in counters, you see it's a mayhem, right? Especially now because of so many requirements. So that technology probably will drive, but overall, essential skills, I think India is ready, and especially with these airlines, IndiGo and Go Air, and SpiceJet, they already ordered their planes well in advance, and so they are already worked on the plan how they're going to recruit or train people, whether it's pilots or whether it's mechanics, and many of the things. Other areas of business, the skill set is being developed nicely, and it's the dominant carrier IndiGo. When you look at it, they're pretty safe, pretty on time, so they've done it right that way. So I don't see issue with the skill set at the moment.
I think that evolution that you talked about there, Sandeep, in terms of customer service and expectation, comes through as infrastructure develops, and obviously we've taken a backward step, haven't we, in terms of traveling has gone from having moved towards being largely electronic in terms of the user interface and experience, back to us all having bits of paper that we seem to have to carry about again. But I think once we get past that, I think the combination of technology and an appetite to grow, combined with infrastructure investment, and it's infrastructure and technology, isn't it, means that will come. It will have to come. And I think as more people travel, then there's an evolution in the market as well in terms of maturity of expectation of what service should be, and I think that drives change as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Conscious of time, so we need to move on. We've got a few more slides to cover, some of which we've really talked around. But this question about could India achieve global hub status with one of its airports, with Delhi, essentially? There's a lot of infrastructure coming, as you said already. There's significant investment being made in airport facilities. Is there an opportunity? What we've seen, certainly in the pandemic thus far, is people talking about being happier to travel directly to destinations, and there's a win for India there, isn't there, in terms of a direct Australia service with Qantas for the first time. But is there also an opportunity to establish itself, I suppose, as a global hub for connecting traffic? Is that something that either of you could envisage as being in India's future?
Deidre, this is the China dilemma occurring in India, isn't it? Where China geographically in Beijing and the two airports that are now in existence is geographically really well placed for some major international to international traffic flows. From Europe down to Australia, it's actually one of the quickest Great Circle routings. From North America down into Southeast Asia, it's an en route point. But it's never become a major hub because there's so much domestic demand and point-to-point demand that the airlines have never really had to focus on connecting traffic. It's not that they need to create an artificial market. And I think that's the challenge for India in all of their major cities, in that there's enough demand from local point-to-point services that the connecting flows have never really been necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Deidre, as John mentioned, you'd see what India needs a hub, which is more domestic to domestic or domestic to international, not international to international as yet. So international to international will take some time. Location-wise, Delhi, even Mumbai sits pretty well. If you look at, older times, all the around the world, if you remember, the Pan Am flight used to go via Delhi, right? So, and United's around the world, the US 1 and 2s, they used to go Hong Kong, Delhi, Chicago, Delhi, Manchester, Chicago. So,
Sandeep, I think the other thing is, if you're going to create a hub like this, you have to, or the potential for a hub has to be underpinned by having an airline who wants and has a business model that will make that work. And in a classic hub context, then India probably will never have that carrier. In a self-connecting, low-fare airline environment, where people self-connect, it could well happen. But we wouldn't really see that as a connecting passenger, because they'd have two bookings, or they might stop over for 72 hours or whatever.
Yeah, and especially if you look at India, big city where the market is. You got Delhi, you got Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, and Calcutta. They are pretty spread out, and there's enough connectivity to these marketplaces. And then the small regional, you can it doesn't create a big hub kind of a scenario. Overall, but when it comes to international services, you will find if you want to compete against Middle East carriers, where they use these 7-8 cities in India, take them all to Middle East and then beyond. If that part, here we are. If India wants to do something for domestic to international, they probably have to. Let's talk about this slide, I think. that has
Yeah,
moved.
I think this illustrates what you're saying, you know, that actually there's a considerable volume of passengers who are routing through the Middle East to go on to the US. As an example, 700,000 passengers in 2019, and you can see that being facilitated by, this is just the Emirates network, you know, into India, and then from Dubai into the US. So, you know, to come in to compete with that on a direct basis, there's a big question, isn't there, about
why would, you know, I mean, strategically, why would you look at what's been created through the UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and equally Qatar, and, you know, why would you try and compete with that? Because these guys are not going to roll over and say, help yourself to all the traffic we've created and the connectivity we've created and the brand loyalty that's been built up over many years, and just let you have the business that is ours. And these guys do it really, really well. And, you know, they serve multiple destinations, 9 cities in the US from Emirates. So, you know, it's very difficult for someone who's going to be able to rapidly compete with that. And whilst you're trying to compete, quite frankly, you're going to blow your brains out. You know, you're going to lose revenue, and you're going to be selling low yield tickets. It's going to be very, very difficult to compete.
Absolutely. This is not, you know, it looks very good, like it's ambitious thinking to say by regulators and by market, hey, all our traffic is going via Middle East. But John, you're absolutely right. Just to convert it back only onto Indian carriers, it's going to take time.
Yeah.
But on the other side, as you know, there's not many wide bodies in India. Just to do this routing, I think all of India's the US routing that Middle East carriers have right now, just to compete with that, India doesn't even have so many wide bodies to compete. No. India has like less than 50 wide bodies, and this routing will ask for more than 50, 70 easily. So it's not gonna be. So that's where, you know, it's something similar has happened in China, where you know, the hubs of Hong Kong, hubs of Seoul and Narita, when the non-stop flights started coming in, and but it took a lot of time, and then as we see in India, you know, China having almost 3 or 4 gigantic airlines, they could do it, but India still doesn't have, they're not enough wide bodies to do this kind of routing yet.
And therein lies the challenge, doesn't it? I think so. We have more slides than we have time left to talk about, so I'm going to skip quickly over this one. But I think this is the interesting thing, isn't it? That we're kind of talking about this slide and the next one. That, you know, IndiGo is obviously by far the dominant carrier, 45% of the market in capacity terms, driver of a lot of that growth that we saw earlier on. And then on passenger terms, you know, 48% of domestic market share.
Yeah.
You know, and that is going to characterize the future development of India's aviation market, isn't it? You know, in terms of, with a carrier so dominant, it's hard for anyone else really to properly compete. And, you know, so carrier dominance of this degree shapes how a market evolves, doesn't it?
Completely. I mean, you know, it's a bit like Ryanair in Europe. It's a bit like Southwest in the United States, and it's a bit like what Asia was to all in some Asian markets. You know, when you end up with a dominant character, that becomes the market profile. And, you know, there are airports in Europe where other airlines have looked at the Ryanair presence and said, we're not going to go anywhere near that, because, you know, it's Ryanair and it's low yield, and it will always be low yield, or that's a perception. And I think because IndiGo now have such a dominant share, the reality is that the Indian market is certainly in the foreseeable future going to be dominated by point-to-point travel, and there will be some self-connecting, but I think it's, you know, it's it's good at what it is, and if it's good at what it is and it works, why change and why try to be something different? You know, because that's a very risky process, and it's unnecessary.
So on a final in our, I think we're just hitting 7 a.m. now. So we'll go over a couple of minutes, and if you have to leave the call, everybody gets a recording of the slides and the audio. So hopefully you won't miss anything. We've got to ask this question. So Tata obviously acquired Air India. How's that going to play out? You know, obviously they need a bit of time to take stock, and we talked earlier about their ability to do that. But how, Sandeep, how do you see this helping shape how India's aviation market grows going forward?
Yeah, no, one good thing that has happened is that Tata or Air India became privatized. Air India was bleeding money, and they were not able to bring forward the the services that's required for India. With Tata coming in, they have a lot of challenges, no doubt. We say they're gonna improve very fast, but I've done 4 or 5 different airlines restructuring, and it's not an easy task. As we discussed earlier, and especially during this pandemic era, it gets very tricky. And then they have areas of, as John was mentioning, what route network they will have, what actually they're looking for. Old Air India days, Delhi was classified as an international hub for them, and they were not able to sustain it. Like, it's still a work in progress. So how fast Tata can do it, but then they have other airlines, the little ones, that they have to either do something or merge them. But overall, one good thing about Tata is they have this hotel division which does great job with the service. Some of the hotels they have, so I think customer services will improve. Tata also have a lot of investment in the infrastructure, like they own the catering, they own the ground services division. So all that, the ecosystem is there. So we see this can really, if they don't work in the silo mentality, this can take off in a big way. And that's where, if you look at now, many airlines around the world are making their decks about Air India, what Air India can do. And I tell you, the Middle East carriers are the first ones they are looking at how what will happen to them, because Tata also has deep pockets, right? So
yeah, Deidre, I mean, it's interesting. None of us know the outcome at the moment, but I think to reassure some of the people who listen regularly, a bit more pessimism from me. I'm not so optimistic about Air India. I think you've got a typo where you say 100-day plan. I think it could be a 10,000-day plan.
Airlines don't have 100-day plan, no way.
That was an optimistic 100 days, I think.
I think that's gone, and it's slightly ironic, I guess, but we've got AZ, which was Alitalia and is now ITA, of course, and we've got AI, and it is Air India the Indian subcontinent equivalent of Alitalia? How many times can you rescue it and try and save it? But fundamentally, the best thing to do is to close it down and let the market readjust. I'm not quite so confident, I'm afraid.
Yeah, slightly controversial comment to end there, John, or maybe just realistic. I think you would probably argue the latter. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there.
Yeah.
We're now just almost 5 minutes over our allocated time. I think we could spend lots more time talking about this, but it's been fascinating to just start to explore some of the challenges and opportunities ahead for this fascinating and incredible country that I think we've just scratched the surface of, really. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for joining us. I very much hope you can get back to at least some rest for the next few hours, as it probably is the middle of the night there for you. And thanks again, John, for joining us. We'll be back on the next webinar, date to be confirmed, but probably towards the end of April. So watch out for that. If you've signed up to OAG's blog, then you'll see details there. And of course, in the meantime, if you are looking for any commentary or updates on the industry, then following OAG's COVID-19 page will give you that. Thanks again to both of you for joining me this morning.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Deidre. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Sandy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.